So let's go back to those two populations that were initially identified. And they were identified by myself, Mary Lee, Paul, and Michael. Crude oil turned into an aerosol when the slick was present in the Gulf of Mexico. It was due to the high winds and the high seas, and it came on shore. And I give an example of when you use a pump hairspray, that's an aerosol that comes out of the pump. So that's what the crude oil was like coming on shore. It moved on shore way before the slick, and remember, it only took 9 days for the slick to make it to shore. And it continued to move on shore every time the wind blew from the south, southeast, or southwest, blowing it on shore. People initially called and said they had headaches, nausea, respiratory impacts, irritation to the eyes, nose, throat, and lungs, asthma attacks. Those were the complaints. And when I'd go out and do workshops, I'd start going through the aerosols forming and it's moving on shore, and these are the health impacts. And they go like, oh, that's why I have all these health impacts. I knew I had a headache, I knew I had nausea, but I was just so busy trying to deal with the situation that I didn't correlate it back. As far inland as New Orleans, and you're at mile marker 100 on the river, people in the New Orleans area were reporting these health impacts when the wind blew from the south. If you remember in 2008, when we had the barge cut in half by the ship in New Orleans, and people were complaining about the smells, the odors, and being nauseated, and the health agencies and the environmental agency said it's not a health threat. Well, these same types of health impacts were associated with the crude blowing inland all the way 100 miles in. Some parents would talk about they'd bring their child to the doctor, and the closer they made it upriver to go to the doctor, the better the child felt. And then when they finished at the doctor and headed south, the child got sicker and sicker and sicker. These health impacts are all along from New Iberia, Louisiana, along Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, and the panhandle of Florida, having these huge health impacts on the community that had nothing to do with the spill and had nothing to do with working to clean up the mess. Then we have the fishermen and the cleanup workers. They experience these same health impacts, but much more severe, because they were right there in contact with it. When they leaned over the boat to pull in the boom, the oil was right there in front of their face. They had skin irritation and sores, difficulty breathing, chest pains, diminished lung function, depression, and suicide tendencies. After Hurricanes Katrina and Rita, Mary Lee and I asked for mental health providers to come into the area, and a lot of the foundations said, we don't do mental health, and we kept telling them how depressed the people were in the area after the hurricanes. Once again, we saw the depression, particularly in the fishing communities, which didn't know from day to day whether they were going to have a livelihood or not. And then we started having suicides, a lot in the fishing community, and a lot of people were on suicide watch. And the depression is growing day by day by day, because it appears to most of these people that there is no end in sight. The cleanup workers are continuing to get sick, and their health impacts cover the long list associated with the crude and the dispersant that I just showed you. So working with Louisiana Environmental Action Network, LEAN provided protective gear and respirators to the fishing workers beginning on May 4th. Mary Lee is a phenomenal person, puts in the order, gets it in, and she and the boys distributed to the fishing community who so desperately wanted those cleanup jobs with BP because, one, they didn't have a job. Two, it was their marshes, their estuaries, they knew it the best, and they wanted to protect it as much as possible. LEAN and fishermen challenged the BP in U.S. District Court on May the 7th. BP signed a consent decree to take responsibility to ensure workers were protected, that they were trained, and they were provided with protective equipment. They signed that agreement on May the 7th. Did it happen? No. Fishermen fearing the loss of their jobs and wouldn't speak up. Their wives spoke up and were telling everybody they could how sick their husbands were, until BP told the husbands, if your wives don't shut up, you're going to lose your job. So then we moved up the ladder of responsibility to OSHA. OSHA is the one who is in charge of protecting worker safety on the job. Interacting with OSHA on their lack of enforcement of worker protection and safety regulations, I had a conference here in New Orleans, and Dr. Michaels, one of the heads of OSHA, was there, and he and I had lunch together, and I told him what the situation was, because Mary Lee and I wound up being the voice of the fishing community. So I told him what was going on, and he said, we have a problem. I said, I know we have a problem, and these people are really sick, and OSHA is not doing anything to protect these workers. On May 16th, OSHA issued a directive on requiring pertaining and protective gear. BP continued to fail to provide the respirators and the protective gear. Mary Lee kept providing them to the fishing community who were working. Workers continued to be required to work while coming in direct contact and inhaling the crude oil and the dispersants. Okay, next one, Paul. On May 24th, OSHA stated they had serious concerns for workers' safety and health in the Deepwater Horizon oil spill response. The system BP currently had in place for workers' safety, health training, and protective equipment are not adequate, according to OSHA, for the current situation or the projected increase in cleanup operations. So OSHA made a statement. And yet, workers continue to be exposed and suffer the health impacts throughout the cleanup effort. This event began in 2010. The BP spill containment and cleanup is a workplace environment. It is unacceptable for workers to be made sick in the worst case place environment in 2010 and continuing in 2011. So those of you who work in industry or other businesses, are you allowed to be made sick in a workplace environment? And yet the workers that were doing the cleanups are required to go to work every day, and as a result of that requirement are made sick every day. It's a workplace environment that they should be being protected by the federal government. And it just, every day, it's a new issue. So then the National Institute of Health, known as NIEHS, on August the 17th, came out with a preliminary plan. We had been dealing with them on conference calls for a month as they developed this plan and expressing our support and our opposition to specific issues. So the plan was the Gulf Coast Worker Study, and it was going to track the health impacts of oil spill workers and volunteers. So Wilma says, there's another whole community, the people on the coast, they need to be included. Well, Wilma, we received $10 million from BP, and we received $10 million from the federal government. So we can only do workers that did the cleanup and volunteers. So Wilma says, but in doing this, you're not providing them with medical care. You're looking at their health impacts and tracking their health impacts over the long haul. Tracking is wonderful, but if you don't have medical care to refer them to, you're just sending them back home sick till the next time it's time to update your tracking. They have limited the study to 75,000 individuals from Louisiana, Texas, Mississippi, Alabama, and the Panhandle of Florida. So if you're not included in this 75,000, your health impacts will not be tracked over the long term. And when you looked at those health symptoms from the dispersant and the crude, you saw a lot of them are chronic long-term health impacts. So if you're not part of the 75,000, you're not part of anybody paying attention. Next. The NIEHS study does not address that large population of community on the shore, as I just told you, and it doesn't provide medical attention. So even though the study will do wonderful things, it doesn't address all of the people that have been impacted by the BP crude.